Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Irene Moncada, an Events Commissioner here at Uniform Seminar. We are pleased to be hosting a webinar titled The Real and Present Threat of Cyber Breach Demands Real-Time Risk Management. The webinar is presented by Simon Marvell. Simon is founder, partner, and CEO of Acuity Risk Management. He has been involved in cybersecurity since 1985. At this point, I would like to hand over to Simon. There will be opportunities for your questions and answers at the end of the presentation. We hope you enjoyed the webinar and we welcome your feedback. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Irene. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to this webinar. Acuity is a London-based cybersecurity risk management software and services company. As Irene said, we're going to talk about the real and present breach demanding real-time risk management. Sorry, bear with me. And I'm going to cover the agenda really in 4 parts. Talk about the need for real-time threat-based cybersecurity risk management, talk about threat and control modeling with some reference to data that's available within the industry, talk about measuring cybersecurity risk again by reference to data available in the industry and with a worked example, and then finish up by talking about the outputs and benefits from cybersecurity risk management. So really I think we're all pretty much aware these days of the real and present threat from cyber breaches. Last year the head of the National Security Agency, Admiral Mike Rogers, was quoted as saying it's not about if you'll be penetrated but when. And we're now in the territory of advanced persistent threats where we have skilled adversaries using sophisticated approaches and tools to try and attack us. And in response to that, then the industry is scrambling to provide solutions, and we're not short of data. There's plenty of data as sort of illustrated on this list here, so vulnerability scanning reports, pen test reports, outputs from SIM and analytics solutions, and audit reports, and so on, as you see going down that list. But sometimes you have to ask yourselves, how much information and knowledge is that actually giving us? Quite often these operate independently by different people. I don't particularly like the word siloed, but quite often that's the case. And often also these approaches tend to be technology focused rather than business focused as well. Okay, but of course our business leaders these days are asking for answers. More and more so, obviously, cyber risk and cyber breaches are becoming top management issue. And the sort of information that business leaders are asking for are what are our current measured levels of cybersecurity risk across the enterprise from the multiple threats that we face, and are these tolerable? If they're not tolerable, what's our justified and prioritised plan for managing these risks down to tolerable levels? Who's responsible and by when? And all of these are risk management questions. And they're the same sorts of questions that business leaders are asking in relation to other enterprise risks, whether they're strategic or competitive risks, other broader operational risks, environmental, health and safety, and so on. And they want to understand cybersecurity risk in the same way that they understand their other enterprise risks. So what do we mean by cybersecurity risk management? Well, this is a definition from the NIST cybersecurity framework, which was published in February 2014. This has been widely circulated and referred to within the industry. Risk management is the ongoing process of identifying, assessing and responding to risk. And NIST go on to say, to manage risk, organisations should understand the likelihood that an event will occur and the resulting impact, and with this information organisations can determine the acceptable levels of risk for delivery of services and can express this as their risk tolerance. And it's increasingly accepted that cybersecurity risk management needs to be threat-driven. This is an extract from a paper written by Lockheed Martin, Threat-Driven Approach to Cybersecurity, and they conclude, and I agree very much with this, up to now contemporary cybersecurity risk management practices largely driven by compliance requirements which force organizations to focus on security controls and vulnerabilities. And this unbalanced focus on controls and vulnerabilities prevents organizations from combating the most critical element in risk management, which are the threats. Management needs to be threat-based. So let's now look at modeling of threats and controls. And here there's an illustration and some terminology, and the terminology varies throughout the industry, but the overall sort of understanding and approach, I think, is consistent in that breaches target data, and that's quite often confidential data such as customer data, other sensitive data. It's not always just confidentiality that's at risk, though. If we have financial data, we might be at risk of fraud and therefore have concerns about the integrity of our data, and similarly we may have concerns about availability. But for the purpose of this example, we're going to talk mainly about breaches of confidential data. That data is accessed through, resides on, is stored in, communicated by assets such as software devices, which include servers, workstations, smartphones and so on, websites, networks, people, third parties and so on. And if a threat actor, for example organised crime or activists, wants to get at that data, then they'll apply certain threats, certain techniques such as crimeware or espionage and so on to get at that data, and they'll usually do that via the assets. And in order to defend against that, we apply controls. So we apply controls, and again the controls are largely applied to the assets. So for example, secure configuration, encryption, vulnerability assessment and remediation and so on, some examples listed there. And it's really a case of whether an attacker can exploit vulnerabilities or weaknesses in control to bypass those controls and gain access to the data. And on the other hand, if we can deploy the right controls, maintain them effectively and efficiently in a proportionate way to the threat that we're facing, then we stand a good chance of defending ourselves against those threats. Okay, just to expand slightly on the controls layer, I like to think of three layers of control. The first one being control frameworks, which are a description, product and service independent description of controls that we would apply to defend against cyber threats. And a very good example, I think, is what used to be the SANS top 20 critical security controls for cyber defense. This has been taken over now by the Centre for Internet Security, CIS. They still maintain this set of controls. Then at the next layer we have controls, solutions and services. So these are products and services which implement the controls within the framework. And then finally, all of this needs to be managed within some sort of information security management system, such as the plan, check, do, act approach of ISO 27001. To look then at some threats, and this is where we start to look at some example data available within the industry. The source of this chart is the Verizon 2015 Data Breach Investigations report. Really interesting document if you haven't seen it. Verizon have been recording information on breaches for a number of years now, and they found that over the last 3 years the breaches pretty much fall into these 9 event patterns: miscellaneous errors, crimeware, insider misuse, and so on, all the way down to payment card skimmers at the bottom. There are other sources of threat information. So within the ISO 27001 family, there's ISO 27005. It has a list of threats within it. The Information Security Forum, which is actually a member-only organization, but they maintain a threat lists. The Microsoft Stride methodology as an example, and also MITRE Corporation, the Common Attack Pattern Enumeration and Classification, and this has about well over 500 attack patterns. So there are different levels of detail in these various example threat lists, but there's a good source of information out there, most of it publicly available. In terms of threat actors, Verizon have also found that most of the breaches are being perpetrated by 4 groups of threat actors: activists, organized crime, state-affiliated or unaffiliated, and we can see the sorts of attacks that are being perpetrated by these different threat actors. So across the top there, for activists, 61% are web app attacks, 31% denial of service, and not very much elsewhere. And we can also see the trends, those bar charts in the background also. Okay. Also available within the industry, we talked earlier about we need to, in order to defend against threats, then we need to make sure that we're deploying appropriate controls. There are also mappings, and increasingly these mappings are becoming available within the industry. So this is a mapping that was in the 2014 Verizon data breach report, and this is mapping the top 20 critical security controls against the 9 event attack patterns that Verizon had identified. So we can see here the mapping between the controls that are most relevant to those particular threats. And again, there are other example mappings available in the Stride methodology. MITRE Corporation, the list of attack patterns from MITRE are referenced to mitigations and also to weaknesses, common weaknesses and common vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those attack patterns. For those that are ISF members, then the IRAM2 methodology also maps controls to threats. And then finally, in terms of availability of information within the industry, the National Security Agency in the US prioritizes the top 20 critical security controls in terms of their ability to help to resist the threat. Okay, and in order to evaluate cybersecurity risk and to present risk in enterprise risk terms and to be able to make judgments on investments in cybersecurity, we really need, if we can, to quantify cybersecurity risk in financial terms. And we also need to use some form of probabilistic measurement for the likelihood of an event, and if we can do that, then we can do these things of prioritising investments and reporting risk in business terms. If we're going to talk about probability, then we need to understand time period. 10% risk of a breach in the next week is much more serious than a 10% breach in the next 3 years, for example. So again, we just need to bear this in mind. Just coming back quickly to Verizon, again, there's really interesting data available on threat event frequency within different industry sectors. So this is telling us which of those 9 threat patterns are most prevalent in these different industry sectors. So if we look at financial services, for example, we can see based on data that's been recorded over the last 3 years and the trends there, we can see that 36% of attacks are crimeware based, 31% are web app attacks, and then you can see the variation for different industry sectors there as well. Again, where else do you go to try and understand the level of threat or the probability of a breach? Well, there are other sources. There's a whole industry that's developed around threat intelligence over the last few years. Either threat intelligence that can be consumed automatically or threat intelligence in the form of sort of higher level reports on losses that have been identified and campaigns that might be being out on the web, dark web and so on in relation to your industry or possibly even specifically to your organization. You can obviously refer to your own incident databases as well, and also the scenario analysis, so actually getting experts together thinking about the likely threat actors, the capability, the motivation of those threat actors, the attractiveness of various assets and data within your organization and so on, and drawing up your own scenario-based analysis of the level of threat. In terms of potential impact, then losses of cyber breaches, from cyber breaches can include lost business from reputational damage, loss of goodwill, increased customer acquisition costs, and increased costs in relation to churn of customers. There are also costs associated with detecting, investigating, and of course responding to a cyber breach. Again, there's information available within the industry. So the Ponemon Institute in the US have researched for a number of years the cost of cybersecurity breaches. This is actually taken from the Verizon 2015 breach report, but it was based on the Ponemon survey. And interestingly, Ponemon saw a correlation between the number of records that were lost and the cost of the impact, so the loss associated with the impact. And so you can see here the increase from 100 records up to 100 million records. And interestingly, you'll see here also we need to be conscious of uncertainty in our risk measurements. We can never be certain. There's always uncertainty involved, and quite helpfully here that Ponemon are showing a range, sort of average, expected, and upper in terms of what ability to react to these changes. So let's sort of build it up, and let's look first of all at a threat from organised crime, a crimeware attack from organised crime against an online payments environment, and let's say that we've risk, and in this, just for an example reason, we're going to use the sort of expected loss arising from a loss of 100 million records, and there's a comment down here, the catastrophic impact on the reputation of the bank if we were to lose 100 million records. And over here then we've recorded the likelihood of a crimeware attack as 36%. If an attack occurs, the likelihood of it being from crimeware, from organised crime, is considered to be in line with the industry average. So we're using some industry data, but of course, as I said earlier, there are other sources of this sort of data as well. In order to mitigate these threats, then as we saw earlier, we need to deploy controls, appropriate controls to mitigate the threat. So this is a list of the top 20 critical cyber security controls that relate to crimeware from the available mappings that have been mapped to this particular threat. And we're showing over here whether we're applying those controls to the environment, or we're applying them and we're measuring them in relation to specific assets or groups of asset. Over here we're showing the relative importance of each of these controls from the NSA attack mitigations, and then over here we're seeing the current status or performance of those controls. So some of them are very good and they're fully deployed, others are less so. One at the bottom is quite weak, and that's one of the top 20 controls require all remote login access to use two-factor authentication, and that's flagged up as red at the moment, and that's because we're only halfway through the rollout of the two-factor authentication project for online payments. Staff access from 2 call centres is still by single-factor authentication. Okay, so we have some weak there, and as a result of very high potential impact, pretty high threat in financial services sector from crimeware, then this is a risk dashboard for an online payments environment, which is showing all of the threats that are relevant to online payments, financial services sector, and the current risk assessment status. And here I've highlighted the one that we've been looking at, organised crime, crimeware on the online payments environment, as a red risk. Okay, so it's an unacceptable risk. We need to decide what we're going to do about that. Okay, so again, using risk management techniques, there may be opportunities to avoid a risk. Might be difficult in this particular case of an online payments environment. It's going to be critical to the business. There may be an option to transfer the risk, potentially using insurance. There's a lot of interest at the moment in cybersecurity insurance, of course. It's quite difficult to transfer the reputational risk, so you might be compensated for direct financial loss and so on. Transferring the reputational risk may be more difficult. It may be possible to reduce the risk by looking to reduce the potential impact. If you're in the health sector, for example, you might be able to separate personally identifiable and clinical data with separate access policies and controls and so on. But in many cases, and in the majority of cases, we're probably going to need to reduce the risk by applying or improving and maintaining appropriate controls to mitigate the specific threats. So if we go back to look at where we've got problems in a number of areas in relation to the performance of our controls. If we look at one of them in particular, this two-factor authentication, now if we're measuring risk in financial terms and we're using some sort of probabilistic assessment of likelihood, then it allows us to model and to draw conclusions such as this. So this is showing us for this particular control, two-factor authentication in the payments environment, which is currently 50% deployed, that by the time that project is fully implemented and we've got two-factor authentication in place for all remote login access to the online payments environment, then we're estimating that our risk from organised crimeware is going to reduce from a red risk to an amber risk. And also interestingly, we find that many controls will mitigate multiple threats. So in this case, two-factor authentication is also helping to mitigate the other threats that we can see here. And again, completion of that project will reduce a couple of amber risks down to green, and will reduce some green risks down further as well. And we can estimate this risk improvement, the overall risk improvement. We call that risk delta. And if we do that, and we do that across our estate, then we can prioritise the control improvements or the remediation of open vulnerabilities, for example, in terms of those that are going to give us the greatest risk delta. So this is very much risk-based decision-making and risk-based prioritisation. And this is going to show you, for example, at the top here we have got two-factor authentication, and it's because largely it's helping to mitigate 7 risks in this case. So really, given a particular threat environment and status, then we are going to want to prioritise our remediation activity, perhaps on those control improvements or vulnerability remediations that are going to help us protect against multiple serious risks, again potentially against multiple assets as well. Of course, I've talked mainly as though this was sort of an operational system. The same applies, and probably you might argue is even more important during the development process as well, in that we need to understand who the threat actors are, the threats that we face, the assets that are going to be at risk, the potential sensitivity of the data and the value of the data, and all of that. So the same techniques are applied during the development phase, and during development, and also certainly in operational use, then things can change and we need to be able to react to that as well. So we might, for example, receive some threat intelligence about new threats or attack patterns that have been identified. This may result in, or we may identify that the likelihood of certain threat events has increased, and in response to that, to model new threats and controls, the risk might increase and exceed our tolerance. So we need to identify the assets that could be affected, review the status of controls for those, and if necessary, initiate improvements and additional controls. And we want to identify and notify business units that might be affected. Similarly, the performance of critical controls might deteriorate, so patch status on certain critical assets, for example, we might fall behind on. If that happens, then the risk levels will increase and may exceed tolerance, so we need to initiate actions to restore performance. We might find that SIM or analytics solutions identify perhaps new threat attack patterns, or indicate increased likelihood or weak controls. Again, the risk levels may increase and we need to initiate action. Vulnerabilities may come in. These will increase level of risk, especially if the vulnerability aligns with an attack pattern, for example, that can exploit that vulnerability. And if that's being used in a current campaign, for example, against the industry or against your organisation and personally, then it's going to move your risk up to a very high level in this particular case. Again, we want to prioritise remediation based on the risk delta. We might identify control non-compliances in self-assessments or audit reports. Again, it will indicate weaknesses in controls, and as a result the risk levels may increase and exceed tolerance, so we need to initiate action. And another example, we may be debating how to prioritise a cybersecurity project, whether to delay a project perhaps due to lack of resources or budget restrictions. So again, if that's the case, then we can model the effect of us remaining at risk at higher risk for longer otherwise if we addressed or deployed that particular project. Okay, so we can assess the risk delta as we showed with the two-factor authentication example and use that to help inform our debate on the proposal. And again, you know, these are estimates. They're all of these risks estimates are just estimates, but they're giving us some quantifiable, sort of measurable information on which it will help to help our decision making. So we've talked and we've looked down at specific threats and assessing the level of risk for specific cyber threats and how that can respond to, in particular, mitigating controls. Not forgetting also that we also want to be able to report up to business leaders in the same sort of format and the same approach that they will be reviewing the status of their other enterprise risk. So again, this is just an example dashboard showing summary of enterprise strategic and reputational supply chain and then specific risks within UK payments. And again, if you're taking a similar integrated approach or an approach for cybersecurity, which may go down to quite a low level of detail but then can aggregate up in a consistent way with your enterprise risk management, then you'll be able to answer those sorts of questions about what's our level of risk and is it tolerable and what are our risk-based prioritizations to address in the areas where it's intolerable. Just to summarize then and draw this to a close, the questions of how secure are we and what are our cybersecurity priorities are risk management questions. We need a consistent risk-based approach for prioritizing remediation and investigative activity and for reporting up to business leaders. Our cybersecurity risk management approach should be threat-driven within the framework of tailored compliance processes where we identify and model threats and attack patterns, measure risk and prioritize our actions based on risk delta. The general threat level is high, coming back to the not if but when quotation, but specific threats can change very quickly. A threat actor could suddenly target you or they could change their tactics in relation to your organization. Your risk will go up if the performance of critical controls deteriorates, so you need to ensure the continuing good performance of critical risk mitigating controls and measure it at an appropriate frequency. So if it's patch status on critical assets, for example, then perhaps daily. If it's event driven, for example, testing web applications for common weaknesses following changes, or it might be something that we do frequently but less, or regularly but less frequently, so perhaps checking the awareness of our staff on cybersecurity, which we might do annually or quarterly or monthly. So cybersecurity risk management is now a critical real-time facilitator in the battle against cyber breaches, and the approach that has been taken in the past of perhaps once a year doing a cybersecurity risk assessment and then putting the report on the shelf for another year really isn't acceptable, and senior business leaders want to know risk status this month, next month, and so on. Finally, from a real-time cybersecurity risk management approach, we will reduce the risk of damaging cybersecurity breaches. It will allow us to control our costs by targeting resources at intolerable risks and avoiding over-control of tolerable risks, help us to prioritize and justify cybersecurity investments by focusing on those solutions which will provide the greatest risk-based return on investment, and it will demonstrate to shareholders, customers, regulators and other stakeholders that we have our cybersecurity under control. That brings the presentation to an end. If you'd like more information and more detail, there is a white paper on our website. It's an 18-page white paper. You can access it by going to our website, following the link to the white paper, and of course, my contact details if you would like to discuss anything that you've heard today further. Okay, I will happily answer any questions that we have at the moment. So I'm going to open up and have a look at some questions. Okay, just have a look. Okay, there's one here which is saying what are the main changes that you've seen in cyber security risk management over recent years, and I think I would say a couple of things to that. Firstly, the availability of, well, they're related really. The availability of public information. So Verizon threat intelligence, data breach investigation reports, I think, really helpful. The various mappings that are now becoming publicly available, which help us to really understand threats and attack patterns and so on, and use a common terminology to describe them, and then also understand which vulnerabilities are going to put us most at risk if they were to be exploited. I think all of that sort of publicly available information is very helpful. Also, the emergence of threat intelligence and that whole industry is really helpful in terms of getting a sort of a more direct feel for what organisations are facing in terms of more specific threats. So if I look back, you know, over the years, then a lot of the time in the past, organisations have been a little bit sort of hunting in the dark and making judgments on the likelihood of certain cyber breaches occurring and so on, and that's been very difficult, and it's sort of, I think, also why the industry's polarised a little bit, in that we've got some very technical approaches with very technical solutions providing technical outputs, and then on the other hand we've got sort of high-level, fairly superficial and fairly trivial assessments of risk that are done at a very high level, and really they're too trivial, and the detailed technical data isn't sufficiently attuned to the needs of the business. So I think what's actually happened in the availability of this information within the industry, and also the emergence of the threat intelligence industry itself, has helped us to bring everything together, and it is now possible to look at things in quite a low level of technical detail and also aggregate up to the business level for business leaders. Okay, one other question I've got here: what is the tool that was there were some screen images of used in the presentation? That's our Stream software solution. Information about that is available on our website. There is actually a free download of that product that's available on the website with a demonstration database and so on, so you can get a hold of it, and if you're interested in trying to model things yourselves, try it out. You're very welcome to do that by going to our website and just following the link to the store. Okay, one final question I can see here: how can risk management help if we've already been compromised? That's a very good question. I think if there are no indicators that we've been compromised, then obviously that's a problem. But of course there is, again, a whole industry of vendors out there providing solutions that are trying to help us to identify those indicators of compromise. And of course there is also these attempts being made to communicate and to share data on indicators of compromise and so on. So we can certainly look out for those, and we should be aware of those. If we see those, then we can obviously start to model and understand what those indicators mean in terms of attack patterns that we might face, and we can therefore perhaps pay particular extra attention to the mitigations related to those attack patterns, and certainly prioritise remediation of any vulnerabilities that that come up that are related to those attack patterns. Okay, that's exhausted the list of questions that we had that I can see. I think there's a couple of minutes left. If anybody else would like to jump in with a further question, I'll be happy to answer.
Okay, Simon, I think if anybody has any question, maybe they can email them to you if they come to mind later on.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And so I think we can conclude the webinar here. Thank you, Simon, for your great presentation. And Simon will speak at our Risk, Security and Compliance Conference on the 14th of July in London. You can find more information about this event on Unicom website, www.unicom.co.uk. Thank you everybody for joining today. We will make the recording available afterwards and we'll send you the link. We look forward to your future participation at one of our webinars or events. Thank you.